So it is with great pleasure that I introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Destin Jenkins. He's a scholar of racial inequality in the United States who's focused on capitalism, democracy, and social movements in the 20th century, bridged the fields of economics, urban studies, and political history. He is currently assistant professor at the Department of History at Stanford University and was in the past the Neubert Family Assistant Professor of History at the University of Chicago, where he had previously been a postdoctoral fellow. Professor Jenkins is the author of the book, The Bonds of Inequality, Debt, and the Making of the American City, which is still rather fresh off the press. And this book is a timely intervention to thinking about the structural aspects that make up racial capitalism. It puts at its center what Professor Jenkins has called in a recent podcast I was listening to, a sleepy industry, that is the municipal finance and its multiple players, to argue that debt is consequential to shaping the cities we live in. Focusing on the city of San Francisco and moving between the local and the national, the book uncovers the ties of municipal finance to the distribution of the city's resources and the construction of its built environment, bringing to the fore the inextricability of power, race, inequity, democracy, and capitalism. Professor Jenkins is also co-editor of the book Histories of Racial Capitalism, and he's also the principal investigator and curator of a digital humanities project titled The Business of Debt. Through much of his research and projects, Professor Jenkins has, quote, sought to explore the contributions to and challenges from a world in which Black life is at once threatened and deemed essential. Whether through the lens of Black internationalism, debt, informality, or environmental history, Professor Jenkins remains committed to exploring stories forgotten or distorted. We're so excited to have you here with us today, and welcome, Professor Jenkins.
Thank you, Sai. Should I take it away? Okay, great. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Really greatly appreciate your time and attention this morning, afternoon, and time zones and so forth. Really happy to be here. Thank you so much, Sai, for that very kind introduction. I always learn a lot about myself, about how other people read my work and are able to put things in conversation and piece the cacophony of sounds and pieces together. So thank you for lending coherence. I greatly appreciate it. Greatly appreciate the invitation from Jacob Faber, for reaching out to me, to Audrey Trainer, and also Raquel Forrester for arranging this Zoom visit, the NYU Urban Research Seminar in the Wagner School of Public Service. Really grateful for the invitation. So what I want to do today is just kind of give a sense of who I am, how I approach the work, urban history, say a bit about what the book is about, The Bonds of Inequality, offer two examples that I think are pretty illustrative of the main argument, and then hopefully end with plenty of time for Q&A regarding the argumentation, the intervention, implications for public policy, however you all would like to pursue the Q&A. I'm happy to take questions. So with that, let me just jump right in. I want to share my screen. So let me see, do that. Can folks see my screen? Okay, great. All right. Okay, great. So as Sai kind of alluded to, I'm a historian of the 20th century US, and my work lies at the intersections of urban history, African-American studies, and the history of capitalism. So far, I've been interested in the financial processes and entanglements that underwrite racial inequality in America and the implications of those entanglements for democracy, public space, and social movements. In this kind of approach to trying to historicize markets in general, but also focusing specifically on financial instruments, entanglements, and relationships, allows me to interrogate the powerful mechanisms of illicit white racial advantage. Excuse me. That is to say, how white Americans secured precious resources and life chances, not necessarily through individual merit, but thanks to the work whiteness performed throughout the 20th century. It also allows me to explore the range of tactics and strategies employed by Black people who challenge the divestment and neglect of their communities. Some of y'all would appreciate this map. I do. A map, of course, a New York City subway map, showing Midtown in particular. And I show this because it really is crucial to my intellectual journey. The debt stuff came much later. But I began to notice the problem of inequality as a child growing up in New York City. As I traveled by subway from my working class neighborhood in Jamaica, Queens, to attend a posh, virtually all white private school in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, I came to notice the qualitative and quantitative differences between familial wealth and disposable income. I noticed the recreational consequences of investment in certain parts of the city, but not others. My childhood was framed by the inequalities of wealth and space and the determined efforts of my parents to navigate the paradoxes of urban life. In the 1990s, this was Giuliani era New York. I came to tangibly encounter inequality through brick and mortar and to understand its implications through the public discourse that would filter into private conversations about power, privilege, and justice with family members. And just the kind of to underscore the point about the differences between income and wealth, and navigating my childhood. The neighborhood I grew up, I was, kind of perceived, or at least perceived myself as the richest kid on the block because I had the new Jordans or the new sports memorabilia. But when I went to my private school, I was probably very likely the poorest kid at the school. And the kids I went to school with had multiple country homes, a home in the Hamptons. And so you get a chance to see the difference between disposable income that allows for the kind of basic recreational goods and attire even, versus multiple homes and intergenerational wealth. So that really got me interested in questions of racial, spatial, and wealth inequality, which are key to the book, which I'll say more about in just a little bit. So if that's my intellectual journey, how I pursue that is by way of engaging in the historiographical conversation, really about the persistence of racial inequality. I see myself in conversation with scholars across a range of disciplines who have tried to account for the persistence of racial inequality, which is to say, how do we explain the persistence despite or perhaps because of extraordinary changes in the political economic structure of American cities and suburbs throughout the 20th century? To my mind, the leading interpretations tend to focus on three realms or topics: work, housing, and penal control. There is the story of deindustrialization or industrial decline. And here I'm pulling an image from the classic work of Tom Segru, who, of course, faculty at NYU. I don't know if Tom's in the building, but if he is, salute, my friend. An incredible resource and really inspiration. But he tells, as many others have, the story of industrial decline. The disappearance of industrial work contributed to the, quote, production of inner city ghetto life, in the words of sociologist William Julius Wilson. This, combined with assaults on labor unions and declining unionization rates, greatly reduced the number of adult Black men, for instance, in the formal labor force. Less work meant lower wages, and more precarious employment meant that families without employer-based insurance could be devastated by the hazards of life. A related story, though one that has a very different arc, is the story of retrenchment. Here we see a document I pulled from an archive, the Mayor Moscone archives. The kind of second sentences highlights the massive cuts in programs for poor and working people. And this is during the 1970s. But this story of retrenchment is kind of a different sort that focuses in on work, or the changing conditions of work. In the upshot, one upshot is to push back on the declensionist narrative, the urban deindustrialization narrative. And the story goes something like this. As deindustrialization made and ravaged the Rust Belt and exacerbated racial inequality, Black women in particular gained a foothold in state and state-related industries. Increased public spending during the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the creation of public sector jobs became, as Michael B. Katz noted, a sort of, quote, hidden labor market policy for Black women. So again, a story that turns on work, but really focuses in on retrenchment and the advantages made possible through, for instance, affirmative action policies in the public sector. Yet, if the expansion of the public sector was tentative at best, we've seen the acceleration of retrenchment and privatization to reverse many of the gains that started to come into play in the 1970s. Others have attended to the persistence of racial inequality by way of focusing in on U.S. housing policy. And by now, the story of New Deal housing policy is well known, and the so-called redlining maps have become a frequent reference point in discussions about the racial wealth gap. Having been structurally advantaged through public-private partnerships, white men and women formed, in some cases, paramilitary homeowner associations committed to white racial homogeneity. So those who focus in on housing often emphasize public policy and violence as a way to make sense of the persistence of racial inequality. Even after Congress ended redlining practices in 1965, the U.S. housing market was marked by what Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor calls, quote, predatory inclusion, or how the inclusion of poor and working class African Americans as homeowners continued, quote, older predatory practices. Indeed, the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis and the erosion of Black wealth can be traced back to mid-20th century racist profiteering in the real estate industry, federal redlining policies, and their afterlives. And lastly, there's the story about the persistence of racial inequality that really emphasizes incarceration. Historians, geographers, and sociologists have traced the ways in which crime control techniques dispersed throughout urban social programs disrupted the lives of millions of American families. The extraction of Black men and women, for instance, depresses family earnings. And upon their release, folks scarred, so to speak, by felony convictions face housing insecurities, skeptical employers, and a liminal citizenship that constrains their voting rights and access to public benefits. So just to kind of tie these three interpretations together, these leading interpretations, one that focuses in on work, the other that focuses in on housing, the third that focuses in on incarceration, foreground the role of the government and federal policy in particular as essential actors and mechanisms in the making of racial inequality. One upshot is not only a powerful critique of liberalism and the belief that individual behaviors are the basis of inequality, but also the assertion that redress lies at the foot of the federal government. And I think another kind of upshot of these interpretations, or what connects them, is really offering a theory of racial inequality. We begin to kind of think about the different theories of racial inequality over time. Of course, you have biological determinism as one interpretation. You have the pushback from Black physicians, say in the 1850s and 1860s, for instance, James McCune Smith, who would emphasize the condition of slavery as the basis of disparities in Black mortality and disease rates. You have early 20th century social scientific thinkers who would push back on the idea that Black people are inherently criminal, which is a thesis, of course, shown and argued most fervently and persuasively by Khalil Gibran Muhammad. And so really you can think about these urban historians, these recent works, as kind of offering themselves a theory of racial inequality that emphasizes structure, for lack of a better term. Some people would call it racial capitalism, but most certainly there's an emphasis on federal policy in particular. But racial inequality is expressed by more than wages, home ownership rates, and draconian limits on personal freedom. Racial inequality is also expressed and experienced through unequal investment in city streets. Some residents come to taste it because of neglected water aqueducts and pipes. It is confirmed by unequal access to the public, and when access is granted, reinforced by underfunded public schools, parks, and the basic infrastructure on which all American cities rely. And all of this is tied up with the ability to float a bond, and coupled with interest rates and other borrowing terms and conditions. For this reason, it is essential to turn to the private bond market as a powerful but understudied generator of inequality and disproportionate life chances. Okay, so what is the municipal bond market? And this is a really important kind of intervention for the project. It's Sai had mentioned, I try to historicize a sleepy industry. I try to do that, and I do so by way of focusing in on the political economy of markets, beginning from the presumption that states shape markets in decisive ways. And in many ways, the municipal bond market is the ideal market to kind of confirm that thesis, right? We're thinking about state and local government borrowers or authorities and political subdivisions of the state who are able to issue a bond or more or less a loan, borrowing through financial markets from various investors. So you see the ways in which states are engaging with private markets, and the ways in which federal policy in particular is really crucial to the structure of the bond market itself. That is to say, investors are willing to trade higher yields through investing their capital in other assets in order to secure tax-exempt interest income, and at mid-century escape high federal marginal tax rates. I'll say more about that in a second. But about the bond market is a politically constructed network that links state and local government borrowers, financiers, investors, and sellers of financial information. You could think of Moody's or the Daily Bond Buyer or other such entities. In and through that market, borrowers issue bonds. Municipal bonds are basically loans used by government issuers to distribute the huge costs of capital improvement projects over an extended period of time, 20 years, 15 to 20 years, for instance. Municipal bond market then is the central means by which cities, suburbs, and the like pay for public housing, in some instances, sewage systems, and public transportation improvements, among other large-scale infrastructure projects. And here's just a sense of change over time. Display advertisement, a fairly routine display advertisement drawn from the New York Times. We see Salomon Brothers note in the first line, highlighting its record or recent performance. During the past 11 months of 1970, the display ad reads, Salomon Brothers co-managed $1.7 billion worth of general obligation and revenue issues. We can talk about the differences between general obligation bonds and revenue bonds, but I highlight because that's one firm who is either as the main underwriter or partnering with other financial institutions, underwriting a tremendous amount of municipal debt. And today's municipal bond market is robust, to say the least. Quote, an average of nearly $435 billion in new municipal securities were issued each year in the last decade, noted a recent regulatory report. But more than dollars and cents are at stake. At the center of the decision to borrow is, as I see it, an ethical and political choice, deciding who and what is worthy of debt, with profound material consequences. And because there is a general unfamiliarity with this subject, we have missed asking why it is that American cities are dependent on financiers, rating agencies, and the private bond market in the first place. Why must they turn to the market to fulfill their most fundamental responsibilities, the provision of infrastructure and social services to their citizens? In many ways, that's the kind of point of departure for the project, to try to historicize what appears to be a timeless relationship, to ask why it is that local governments are dependent on the bond market for such basic infrastructure. And to refuse the idea that that's just an inevitable relationship, to try to historicize that relationship, do so more of that in the dissertation by thinking about the late 19th century, but really seeing the 1930s as a moment of rekindling a public-private partnership, a most unique one. So that's really what my book is. One of the things, one of the questions I take up in the book, the other is around the ethics and morality of municipal debt, I suppose you could say. And in general, though, in short, it's about the politics of municipal finance. It resituates the history of urban development and racial inequality after World War II in the financing networks that made the construction of urban infrastructure possible. The story picks up during a fleeting moment of low interest rates just after World War II, and it ends in the 1980s, a period when high interest rates punished cities already reeling from multiple rounds of retrenchment. Rather than treat federal policy as the benchmarks and narrative anchors, say 1937 to 49, which is usually a familiar benchmark in works of urban history, or 49 to 68, but rather than use federal policy as the benchmarks, I suggest that shifting interest rates gave this period, the post-World War II period, unique historical shape. The convergence between investors in search of tax shelters from high federal marginal tax rates and the promise of low borrowing costs for cities powered the reconfiguration of the built environment. Although centered in San Francisco, by bringing to life the individuals, institutions, and milieu through which borrowed funds were generated, my book provides a unique view of the post-war city, one in which the critical dynamics that drove its creation extended beyond the boundaries of San Francisco itself and the local politics, all the way out to the banks, credit raters, and the national municipal bond market. Whereas most histories of urban inequality have tended to focus in on real estate agents, mortgage bankers, homeowner associations, and labor unions. In my account, bondholders, financiers, sellers of financial information, and municipal technocrats are the key actors. So in many ways, I like to think about sort of broadening the narrative stage, so to speak, to include a set of actors who at most have been shadow players. Beyond the difference in actors, the other key distinction is that unlike stories that have privileged local heroes and villains, my story follows the life of a municipal bond, so to speak, that is handled by a set of local and national actors that function within and independent of local idiosyncrasies. And so in that sense, I'm very much influenced by commodity studies. And we could think about the new histories of capitalism that have focused in on cotton, for instance, or other kinds of commodities from the point of cultivation to the point of consumption. I draw on a similar sort of approach vis-a-vis with regards to a financial instrument, in this case, municipal bonds, to think about how a local issue is underwritten by national actors, national financial institutions, but also the ways in which credit then gets turned back into fixed capital to look at inequality in place-based ways. To tell the story, the book draws on a range of little used or newly discovered sources, the Daily Bond Buyer, for instance, or the personal papers of a gentleman by the name of Alan K. Brown, who by the end of his career was described as Mr. Municipal Bond. And it's the unique archive that allowed me to tell the story in the book, to think about the bond market as being created, actively stitched together, and to use Brown's pedagogy, if you will, to try to teach myself first how the bond business worked, and also to try to teach the reader. The book pulls from state archives, engaging the critiques of elected officials. It reads the documents of credit rating analysts not as transparent reflections of the economy, but as a window onto the ideas and habits of those who upgraded and downgraded the bonds of cities. And it places the Black press in conversation with other journalistic critiques of the bonding process. In so doing, I uncover the ways in which African Americans engage matters of municipal finance, which I refer to in the book as Black bond politics. The book makes two arguments. The first relates to the structural dependence of local governments on the bond market and the origins of that dependence. New Deal banking reforms, commonly lauded for their accomplishments, are equally notable for what they did not do. To take one example, the famed Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which separated commercial from investment banks, did not sever the role of commercial and investment banks as lender to the American state. This allowed for the continued distribution of financial power among the private sector. The impact was that public infrastructure and social services would continue to be financed along a public-private axis. This coupled waste management systems and school construction, for instance, to the lending criteria of an unelected fraternity of financiers, bond attorneys, and rating analysts. It has been said that debt is a means of governance, and I'm paraphrasing the work of Marxist scholar Maurizio Lazzarato. And if debt is a means of governance, if so, New Deal banking reforms were the legislative trigger, or at least rekindling. The second argument is that racial inequalities in San Francisco were critically tied to these financial entanglements. The racial politics of the bond market, the mid-century bond market, which privileged infrastructure for white people, even as it was paid for by all citizens, shaped and was shaped by local development policies. So I want to turn now to a few examples, I think, to speak to this latter argument. My hope is to kind of to highlight the impacts of municipal debt and seemingly abstract financial processes on the lives of city residents. I kind of take infrastructure, something as mundane as parking, a parking facility, to actually think about the web of indebted relationships and how people are conscripted into a debt arrangement, even if they haven't voted on it, or in some cases voted against it. In so doing, I illustrate that city residents aren't undifferentiated subjects. The racial hierarchy in which they are slotted becomes an essential mediating factor in distributing the burdens of municipal debt. Let's begin by exploring, and this is where the book kind of takes off, the extraordinary pressures facing post-war San Francisco, and really thinking about the ways in which the built environment was taxed physically during World War II. We're thinking about parks, for instance, appropriated for wartime purposes, or the weight of heavy machinery for war production beating down on city streets. So remaking the built environment, in some cases, parts of the built environment that had been constructed some 30 years prior was a key imperative. A second imperative was dealing with the stresses of an increased population in the city. War production caused, quote, a mass in-migration, which is without duplicate since the days of gold, explained one of the city's largest landlords. Indeed, between 1940 and 1950, San Francisco's population rose from close to 635,000 to more than 775,000 people. And perhaps most astonishingly, and this is a key kind of demographic fact for the book, the city's Black population jumped from 4,800 to more than 43,000 in those same years. So in some sense, San Francisco's, what was the second great migration for many other cities, Chicago, Detroit, was the first great migration for the city of San Francisco. There were also distributionary struggles related to these demographic changes. How to meet the infrastructural demands of longtime residents and newcomers. How to accommodate the calls for new housing in place of slums, new parks in lieu of makeshift playgrounds underneath highways, new public schools to replace, quote, cracker box-like structures. Municipal technocrats in charge of the purse, comptrollers, city accountants, the kinds of folks who are often appointed or rarely discussed, who were in charge of the purse, had to deliver and manage these fiscal demands to set the city on the path toward economic growth while also maintaining political stability. And how would they do all of this in a city that was described as land hungry? At less than 50 square miles, San Francisco had considerably less land available than there was in, say, LA, Chicago, or Detroit. Indeed, quote, there was little vacant land upon which new structures could be placed, noted a group of city planners. Those are kind of the constraints and the pressures that the book really tries to historicize and in some sense kind of conditions the subsequent discussions and debates around development in the city. And so if those are the pressures, what were the opportunities, at least in the eyes of city technocrats? In the spring of 1946, some of the top-rated cities in the country could turn to the bond market and borrow huge amounts at less than 1%. This historically low cost to borrow could prove the antidote, if you will, to overlapping demographic, infrastructural, and fiscal pressures. Because land was fixed, the immediate questions before many of those San Francisco technocrats became which kinds of projects, which neighborhoods, which communities would be rendered worthy of debt. And the question, of course, of worthiness is not just an economic one, it's layered. At once a consideration of different interest groups in the city, a matter of governance, and an issue of economic growth. Put simply, the approach to infrastructural investment in the post-World War II period became a reflection of political, economic, social, and ethical considerations. One of the kind of key interventions, and I'm very much informed by the new work from Keeanga Yamada Taylor, from Peter Hudson, from Nate Conley, folks who have tried to think about economic processes along the color line, to paraphrase my friend and colleague Nathan Conley. So that's the kind of the interventions, the recent interventions that very much informs my own approach to the study, say, of economic growth. And in the book, I treat economic growth not as an objective deracialized pursuit. It rested on the ground of whiteness. In San Francisco, this meant adapting and fashioning the built environment to meet the demands of the white middle class. Embedded in countless city planning documents was a hope that white middle-class professionals would resist the pull of suburbanization, drawn instead to the proximity of work downtown, gorgeous views of the San Francisco Bay, and improvements to the consumer playground. And here's a kind of quintessential city planning document written or produced in 1947, where you see a gentleman kind of selling downtown apartment living by pointing to the sketches of a tennis court and say in the bottom right, the San Francisco Bay, the kind of gorgeous views and proximity to work. In other words, if we think about the kind of existential dilemmas of city officials, of urban officials, during the post-World War II periods, how do you keep a kind of white middle-class constituency and keep them from leaving the suburbs? Well, one is you refashion downtown space to meet their needs. And if they do leave, you find ways to replenish and redevelop downtown to accommodate the needs of suburban shoppers. And foundational to this was an ideological belief that privileged the white male subject often as the basis for economic growth. And this is the great work of Christopher Low and Agee, who has shown this in his work on San Francisco. You might say that the saying was something along the lines of convince them, that is a white middle class, to stay as residents, workers, and consumers, and you might avoid the horrors of urban decline. Historians have traced the politics of consumption and its importance to shaping post-war racial class and gender identity. This great work of Alison Eisenberg and so many others. But they have largely missed the infrastructural basis of the consumer's republic, to borrow a familiar title from Liz Cohen. We might take the example of parking as indicative of the broader and costly effort to accommodate white consumers, tourists, and professionals, as part and parcel of the broader infrastructural investment in middle-class whiteness. In November 1955, San Franciscans have rejected an $11 million bond measure for off-street parking. The San Francisco Parking Authority soon emerged as a vehicle to circumvent the wishes of voters. In the spring of 1958, that authority borrowed $4.5 million from two investment banks, using a portion of the funds to construct a massive car garage beneath the Civic Center Plaza. So just I want to pause really quickly. I mean, just in that example alone, we have the question of democracy, or at least the kind of flattened choice placed before voters, yes or no to a local bond issue, the creation of authorities, thinking about state building. It's the great work of Gail Radford, authorities as creatures of the state, political subdivisions of the state with their own borrowing powers. We could think about negotiated sales between this authority and the investment bank, and the kinds of terms that might have gone along with the $4.5 million extended to the authority. And again, the transformation, if you will, of credit or a loan into fixed capital or a fixed infrastructure in the form of an off-street parking garage, and how central that garage then would be to consumption, for instance, in nearby downtown shopping districts. Indeed, the borrowing arrangement allowed shoppers to find parking before, say, strolling the aisles of Saks Fifth Avenue. But it did much more. The authority had to generate $325,000 annually to pay back garage bondholders, parking garage bondholders. If revenues fell short, however, the city and its taxpayers were responsible for covering any remaining deficits for a period of time. The debt arrangement, in effect, had conscripted all San Franciscans into a project they had never voted on. The city's Black and brown residents in particular became liable for an arrangement designed especially for white middle-class shoppers. And so really we're thinking about, that's what, going back to my earlier point about the paradox of urban life, the ways in which formally one is allowed to navigate different city spaces, but informally how those spaces may not be are only reserved for certain folks. And of course, discrimination and exclusion, there's nothing informal about it. But that's kind of what I'm getting at when I think about the paradoxes of urban life and kind of infrastructural basis of those paradoxes. So San Francisco's infrastructural investment in whiteness, and that's a term I use in the book, rested on, and forgive the kind of cumbersome term here, but it rested on an intra-racial cross-class compact, whereby white workers erected the urban amenities white middle-class residents and visitors enjoyed and depended on. So by 1948, just as some context here, state and local government capital outlays reached $3.7 billion, which paid for everything from highways to streets, schools to hospitals, sewage treatment to water systems, electric utilities to transportation, parks to urban renewal. And paid for is perhaps too generous, covered the messiness, really kind of the messiness is not fully captured by paid for or covered, but those were the capital outlays. And those capital outlays not only remade the built environment, it effectively afforded segregated wages to white workers. In San Francisco during the 1950s and early 1960s, skilled construction jobs were for white men, and the city's building trade unions worked to keep it that way. Some Black craftsmen found work through Cement Masons Local 580 and Laborers Local 261, but many more were slotted into jobs or went without employment altogether. The International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union rarely confronted the Building Trades Council to desegregate craft unions, and the city rarely interfered. And so all of that is the kind of context for the working class aspect of the infrastructural investment in whiteness. Segregated wages for white workers protected by segregated building trades, able to build the infrastructure that the white middle class relies on for consumption, or in this case of BART, movement from the suburbs to work downtown in the commercial office district. And again, going back to this idea of an intra-racial cross-class compact, we can also think about upper-class whites. Because capital flowed upward before white folks parked their cars in downtown parking garages, or before they attended the new San Francisco Giants Stadium, or arrived downtown via the BART transportation system. Indeed, before white workers even began constructing these projects, institutional and wealthy individual investors collected tax-exempt interest income on the bonds they held. Although it is difficult to determine the identities of individual bondholders, shielded as they were by fiduciaries, they were almost certainly white. And this was at once an artifact and continuing means of the racial wealth gap. So if slavery, dispossession, racial discrimination, and exclusion were foundational to white wealth, the bonding process became still another means of wealth creation for white people across class. The infrastructural investment in whiteness was often predicated on dispossession and displacement of San Francisco's Black and brown residents. And the urban renewal project in the Western Addition Fillmore neighborhood is particularly illustrative. If the 1941 edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book is any indication, San Francisco had few hotels and restaurants, few barbershops and service stations afforded Black travelers. But not long after their arrival and settlement, Black folks went to work, building a vibrant, albeit segregated commercial landscape. There was the New Orleans Swing Club and Elsie's Breakfast Nook. In 1942, Wesley Johnson Sr. purchased a building and converted the first floor to house a club, the Texas Playhouse, Club Flamingo, and the second floor for the Hotel Texas. Black San Franciscans in their finest garb might hope to catch Count Basie, Billie Holiday, and Sarah Vaughan at the Bop City's Celebrity Night. Willie Brown, later the city's African-American mayor, arrived in 1951. He and other Black San Franciscans, quote, would get dressed to kill. They sported Stacey Adams shoes with white strings, showing that they had been cleaned with Clorox. In some, the Fillmore Western Addition neighborhood was the cultural hub for San Francisco's Black population, journalist Wade Woods later recalled. And he also mentioned that it was financially thriving. Yet the pressures, again, going back to the demographic, the land, infrastructural pressures and fiscal pressures on post-war San Francisco overpowered Black entrepreneurial ambitions, smothered a cultural renaissance, ruptured newly formed social ties. Just as Black folks were remaking the Fillmore into their own image, the city's planners, supervisors, and other interested parties marked the neighborhood for wholesale clearance. The story of urban renewal is familiar in the example of Negro removal during the 1950s, as James Baldwin described it in a tremendous film, Take This Hammer, released in the spring of 1963. But the story of urban renewal has also been folded into a much longer, into a national story and a much longer story about the seeming timeless mechanism of Black expendability. But what is less known is how urban renewal was financed and how Negro removal was intimately tied to the entanglements, dependencies in terms of municipal debt. So really quickly here is just, if I can step away from just from the script here, I guess. Here is a document from the Daily Bond Buyer. You can tell that the font is probably about size 5 or 6. It's probably around this time that my eyes went down the drain. But here is a notice of sale specifically for Western Addition Urban Renewal Project. But you can see in the bottom right, redevelopment agencies all across the country, in the case of the bottom right in Pittsburgh, issuing similar kind of notices of sale, borrowing through the bond market to carry out many of the things for which redevelopment agencies are known. In late September 1958, Joseph Alioto, who later became the mayor of San Francisco, at the time was chairman of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, advertised the sale of $11 million in short-term notes, short-term debt, to finance urban renewal in the Western Addition Fillmore neighborhood. The notice of sale specified that the debt was, quote, a special obligation of the redevelopment agency, but was also secured by a requisition agreement, basically a contract between the agency and the federal government. The legal opinions of bond attorneys Orwick, Dahlquist, Harrington, and Sutcliffe were furnished to underscore the validity of the notes. In basic terms, the redevelopment agency used this contract with the federal government as security to borrow funds through the private bond market, presumably at more favorable interest rates. So really just quickly there, I mean, I think it's a particularly rich example because it lets us know who has a hand in shaping the validity of this debt instrument. So we have bond attorneys working for Orwick, Dahlquist, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. They play a role. What would happen to a borrower without the opinion of a formally recognized bond attorney is a good question. Would that lead to, or the lack of a kind of an opinion from a certified bond attorney, would that affect the cost to borrow? That is to say, an unfamiliar borrower issuing an unfamiliar debt instrument, how would that affect the cost to borrow and the other strings that came attached? But in this case, the redevelopment agency insisted that these were legitimate debts backed by formally recognized bond attorneys and would hopefully, ideally, from the standpoint of the redevelopment agency, come with lower interest rates. As the principal player in buying, holding, and selling California municipal debt, Bank of America purchased the notes in late October of 1958. In so doing, they had their cake and ate it too. Its bankers profited from infrastructure for white suburban communities and the attempt to remake San Francisco into a hospitable place for white consumers and residents. The infrastructure investment in whiteness allowed for profits through displacement and emplacement, profits through the destruction of slums and the infrastructure laid in its wake. Equipped with borrowed funds, the redevelopment agency executed eminent domain, facilitated Negro removal, acquired and cleared land. Its city planners helped make white middle class, or at least they hoped they could make white middle and upper class space by selling land to developers of high-rise luxury apartments. And it's really striking. By the late 1970s, you have reports in the Sun Reporter, the African-American newspaper in the city, basically decrying vacant land. So you had this commercial landscape that was thriving, financed through the destruction and removal of this thriving landscape, destroyed and with land that remained vacant some 20 years later, effectively taking property off the tax rolls and potentially contributing to the urban fiscal crisis by way of having this vacant land on just standing there, laying there. The agency used the proceeds of land sales to pay off federal loans. And if there were delays in site clearance and reselling that land, they also collected rental revenue from Black tenants. So we could think about the state, this redevelopment agency as a borrower, as a landlord, as wearing multiple hats, if you will. The multiple and overlapping debt entanglements between the federal government and the redevelopment agency, between the redevelopment agency and Bank of America, between the city and its bondholders, constituted a powerful and an unexplored vector in shaping local development policies. Because land was fixed, reclaiming and selling previously inhabited land to developers of high-rise commercial office buildings and luxury apartments was a cornerstone of land use policy. Privileging this form of land use might allow the redevelopment agency to repay its debt. A successful development might generate enough revenues for the city at large, guaranteeing timely interest and principal payments to other bondholders. It might also obviate higher property taxes, helping to maintain political stability. Cities need revenue, and so they bet on whiteness. The pressure to ensure that new housing, commercial development, and amenities would generate enough funds to pay off creditors led to the preferencing of those tenants and workers deemed low risk, a racialized assessment that equated to white professionals. I want to kind of conclude here, but with a few remarks about kind of where the book, right? This is a crucial part of the book, first part, but then it thinks about the kind of revolts and reactions to this debt arrangement, to this infrastructure investment in whiteness. So I'll just gesture toward that, but of course there's much more to say. We often think about dispossession in terms of property as the dissolution of the ownership rights to land and income generating assets. But the story of urban renewal in the Western edition speaks to another aspect of dispossession. Black folks were displaced and deprived not just of housing and business establishments, but also of the ability to call San Francisco their home. Even those who remained would come to reside in a city whose structural foundation depended on whiteness. And so a city that wasn't built for them could never be theirs. But that doesn't mean they didn't try. The infrastructural investment in whiteness and dispossession through debt set the stage for the revolts of the 1960s. Time prevents me from expounding on the revolts of Black folks, residents of Chinatown, and white workers and middle-class white women against this post-war debt arrangement. I take this up in chapter 6 of the book, Revolt, in this idea of Black bond politics, legal injunctions, and extraordinary critiques of the city's disproportionate spending priorities. But the point I want to land on is twofold. First and foremost, these were revolts against the post-war debt arrangement that focused on local bond measures and were occasionally successful. And yet they failed to ascend to the level of critique that might expose the structural relationship between borrowers and lenders, a crucial foundation of racial inequality. It's a long way of saying a focus on local issues without asking the question why it was the cities were dependent on the bond market to begin with. Second, the structural dependence of local governments on the private bond market, a dependence rekindled through New Deal banking reform, actually allowed bankers to fold these revolts into their broader calculations about investing in cities. This meant critical acts of resistance, the civil rights movements or aspects of the Black freedom struggle, the urban rebellions became the basis for credit rating downgrades and extractive interest penalties that entrenched racial inequality, presaged future distress, and further harmed those savvy enough to be critical of municipal debt in the first place. And perhaps you can think about the ironies of success, of a successful effort to challenge the city's spending priorities that then gets folded into the ever increasing list of reasons to penalize and downgrade a city. So really in that sense, the book tries to think about the forms of Black bond politics, for instance, but also always tries to think about the kind of ironies of success, the ironies of local forms of fiscal politics. And with that, I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully with plenty of time, I really look forward to the questions. I try to gesture towards what the book does after the kind of redevelopment stuff and during the early part of the book. But yeah, happy to take some questions about what I've said and the implications and so forth. So thank you for your time.
Max, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, well, I'm an urban sociologist by training, and I really appreciate this presentation because it is a neglected aspect looking at the municipal bonds and finance situation. But I would like to see, or I'm wondering, you sort of downplay the federal role and upplay the role of the municipal bond market. Could you talk a little bit more about the intersection of federal policy and the municipal bond markets, like how the urban renewal programs at the federal level were related to the bond markets at the municipal level, and maybe have the two of them work together to reinforce, white infrastructural investments?
Absolutely, Max. Thank you for the question. I mean, when I tried to I don't mean to downplay the federal role. What I mostly meant at the beginning was federal policy so often is identified as the narrative anchors of a story, right? Housing Act of 1937 as initiating public housing, 1968 is the turning point when public housing went to hell. But federal policy as the benchmarks of telling urban histories and stories of urban inequality. And I want to say that interest rates might be is another way to frame a story. And of course, it's absolutely informed by federal policy, right? Federal Reserve policy, for instance. So it's not necessarily to say that federal policy doesn't matter, but is to try to imagine other ways of structuring our stories, other ways of telling our narrative arcs. And for instance, in my case, it's why the period I try to distinguish or differentiate the so-called post-World War II period into two phases, two periods, the one of low interest rates from 45 roughly to about 1966, until from 1966 to the early 1980s, really a low to high interest rate regime. So that's kind of my point and critique around the overwhelming focus on housing policy and federal policy when it comes to structuring our stories. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we can think about two examples of how federal policy informs and shapes, and in some cases directs the movement of the bond market, if you will, by way of federal tax policies. If we think about the federal marginal tax rate, for instance, in 1951 for incomes over $1 million, I mean, we're talking about folks in the 90% bracket, subject to a federal marginal tax rate at remarkable levels, and the ways in which being subject to such federal taxes is going to direct investment patterns. And in this case, investing in tax-exempt municipal bonds. And so one of the things I try to say is the way in the book is the ways in which municipal bonds are effectively mid-20th century tax shelters, the kind of precursor to offshore tax havens, which we see certainly today, but come really So yes, that's one example of federal policy in its intersection with the bond market in shaping inequities, investing in certain kinds of projects that are deemed less risky than others. And then the other ones, the other kind of intersection between the bond market and federal policy is around just, for instance, public housing. We could think about the ways in which the bondholders for public housing projects are always made whole. That is to say, rain, hail, sleet, or snow, they get theirs. And the ways in which the prioritization of bondholders through these federal guarantees is going to mean less funds invested in public housing projects, less funds invested in the spaces in which public housing tenants call home. And so there's a way in which federal policy around government guarantees is going to prioritize bondholders over increasing the tenants who are increasingly Black and brown over the 1960s onward. So those are just kind of two examples of the intersection between policy and the bond market. But I do think the larger point around imagining other ways of structuring our urban histories without necessarily relying on housing acts in particular and federal policy is something I'd like to leave the group with and think through myself.
If I could just quick follow up, do you think that the bond market sort of supplanted the federal investments? You know, how federal investments in cities began to decline, like Ford saying to New York, drop dead infamously. And if the bond market kind of took over because the municipal bond market, because the federal government was refusing to invest directly in cities?
Yeah, Max, another terrific question. That's how the book ends. It thinks about how cities were increasingly pushed into what I describe metaphorically as the lion's den. In the context of federal retrenchment, declining aid directly to cities are going to have to turn to the bond market, and that bond market is going to come with remarkably high interest rates. And so that's the kind of, towards the end of the book, I highlight the role of or the kind of trajectory of declining rates of federal investment in cities and the reliance, the increased reliance on the bond market at arguably extractive interest rates, and the kinds of projects then cities pursue. Right? How does one generate enough revenue to pay back bondholders at 8, 9, 10% a clip? What kinds of projects are pursued? Is it schools? How are you going to generate enough in interest income through public schools? What other kind of public-private partnerships, other kind of usage of the public purse to borrow on behalf of private businesses will we see in order to generate enough revenues, in order to generate enough funds to make sure bondholders are whole? But that is absolutely related to the decline in federal investment that we see over the course of the 70s. You brought up drop dead to New York City as one example, but the examples are many. So thank you, Max, for the questions.
Thanks for that really amazing talk. I'll, as someone who studies the long-term consequences of federal redlining, I'll not take your kind of municipal focus as a personal attack, but this talk really it really checked a lot of boxes for me, and I have like a million kind of thoughts and questions about this. One of the things that struck me and kind of early on in your talk and really stuck with me through was this example of like of the parking lot, right? And you know, one of the things that I try to do in my own work kind of more increasingly is thinking about this relationship between is, you know, kind of George Lipsitz argues the like racialization of space and the spatialization of race, and how concepts of geography and various forms of finance and investment kind of shape our concepts of race. And this parking lot example kept thinking like, okay, so this is in the kind of on its face an amenity for suburban inclined and therefore kind of whiter households. And I'm wondering if there's a deeper thought about what this is a symbol of rather than just a kind of amenity, and how does so you've talked a lot about how kind of race shapes kind of lending, and I'm wondering about kind of flipping that and how kind of lending shapes our concepts of race.
Jacob, great observations. Here's where I'm going to go with this, just because I think behind the question, what I'm hearing in the question is, I've thought a lot about the kind of material practices of how investment shapes physical space, gestured towards the kinds of bodies that inhabit and move through that space. But probably not enough about the symbolism, right? The symbolic aspects of a parking garage and how that then affects race, racial dynamics. I mean, to my mind, I mean, what I take away with the parking example, for me, it's really crucial, is rethinking the narratives around privatization. Honestly, we often think about parking meters as like one example in which we see the kind of privatization of public assets, the kind of distribution of delivery and management of public aspects to the private sector. But the parking garage example to me is suggestive in that I wonder if we can think about rethink the 1970s and think about privatization first through a history of, say, parking lots to parking meters, but to think about how debt actually presages and the specific terms of debt actually one conscripts various city residents who don't have a choice at all into a debt arrangement, and how if the city comes short, or if that parking authority comes short, then certain terms and concessions must be met. And so for me, the ways in which I think about the parking piece is again in terms of who has access to downtown parking space, and how in the mid 20th century only certain folks could have access, and how nevertheless many folks were conscripted into that arrangement. But also how through a focus on debt, we could perhaps rethink the stories and turning points around privatization, because indeed this is a pretty routine borrowing arrangement around parking in the 1950s. And again, that's well before the 1970s parking stuff, privatization stuff that we normally see.
Hi, Destin. Thanks so much for the shout out
Hey,
at the
Tom.
beginning. Thanks for the shout out at the beginning of your presentation. This is such a terrific project on so many levels, and I'm thrilled that you're here at NYU today. I have a question about the politics of bonds. That is, as a relatively high information voter, I'm called upon, nearly every election year to vote on some bond issue. I usually don't know what I'm voting for. I look at the wording on the ballot and I said, oh, that's good. Let's construct X, or let's do Y, without really thinking about the deep implications underneath it. And so I'm actually interested in how voters in San Francisco or in other cities responded to the bond issues that you're writing about, and specifically around social movements, challenges to municipal bonds, around the inequities that you describe so powerfully in your analysis. And on the other side of it, I'm also really interested in the role of bond financial firms in behind the scenes lobbying and attempting to shape the direction of municipal bond policy in cities. So two different facets of the political history of bonds.
Great questions. Thank you, Tom, for joining and coming today. Okay, let me kind of I guess I'll work backwards, just thinking about financial institutions and the kinds of lobbying, perhaps is the word you use, around local bond issues. I mean, what I discuss in the book is this process of screening, right? And thinking about the kind of cult of expertise that is going to basically insist that the bonding process, borrowing, issuing debt, repaying debt, must be insulated from popular input. And that's an agreement that is articulated across various forums, most notably the Municipal Finance Officers Association, where you have credit rating analysts talking with technocrats. Look, we have to insulate the bond process from democratic input, and we have to rely on the experts being the people who buy and sell and rate debt every day. And so the lobbying part comes into play, if you will, by way of appointments of banking officials to local bond screening committees. So the gentleman, Alan K. Brown, who I mentioned earlier, is not only the key point person for Bank of America's municipal bond department, he is also someone who was appointed and reappointed to San Francisco's bond screening committee. And what that does is allow him and the other folks, and the power differentials are, of course, are present. For instance, somebody who is a laborer maybe has less say than a banker on this bond screening committee. And I'm just sort of taking a guess, because I actually was never able to find the records of the bond screening committee. But nevertheless, the bond screening committee is able to see proposals before they ever are presented to the public. They're able to trim back dollar amounts. They're able to elevate or suggest one bond measure over another. And so that's one way, not so much through lobbying through the financial institution, but how the person who works for the financial institution is also appointed to a local committee to shape the local spending priorities in the bond measures that come before voters. So that's one form of politics. The other form of politics is just thinking about voters and how they respond to local bond issues. And so I'll just kind of pull out two examples. One example, which is specific to San Francisco, the other, which is more national. And what I talk about in the book is how you have Black folks in San Francisco by the mid 1960s who more or less are writing. They're writing for the San Francisco Black newspaper, the Sun Reporter, and basically saying for 20 years we've supported these local bond issues and haven't gotten anything in return. We've seen very little investment in our communities, and more or less, in some sense, advocating kind of patronage politics. That if you want us to support and use our political capital as Black political elites to mobilize Black residents to support these bond measures, we need appointments to, say, the Public Utilities Commission. So there's a kind of insistence that in order for us to support the local spending priorities, we must get ours by way of appointments, jobs, and so forth. And so that's as we see the sun kind of, it's raining the last 2 days, kind of beaming in. That's one way in which local Black folks in the city are insisting that without getting our just due, we're going to torpedo these issues. And indeed, in the mid 1960s, you see the Sun Reporter reject a number of issues, saying that without such concessions, we won't support them. And so the politics there is around investment, but it's also around jobs and appointments. And so you see that articulated in the Black press. So, you know, that Tom, you also mentioned this point about knowledge, like how one gets knowledge of the specifics of a local bond issue. And that's a great question. I mean, my general sense is that just because the bonding process is so insulated, I'm not quite sure what information folks were working with at the time, but I do think that there was a calculus around if we're being asked to ultimately service the debt by way of, say, taxpayer dollars to fund, say, an airport issue, or, and I guess that's a revenue bond, but a school issue or a park, then we wish to have political appointments. We need community investment. And so the calculus is there, even if it's unclear what the relative knowledge is about the specifics of a bond issue and so forth. So that's one example. The second example around the politics, kind of the politics of bonds, to me is the example was thinking about CORE and the NAACP in the early 1960s. And a fascinating understudied campaign, I highlight this a little bit at the end of the book in the epilogue, is the attempt by folks within those organizations to try to turn off the faucet, if you will, that's underwriting racial segregation of public schools in the South. In other words, the argument is, and they're writing to attorney generals in Massachusetts and Illinois and Pennsylvania, insisting that, in fact, this is a violation of Brown v. Board, that you have financial institutions who are not disclosing the risk to their investors, who are underwriting public schools that are effectively unconstitutional. And that's a remarkable campaign because it's thinking about the South as a political unit and trying to undermine the bond market for segregated municipalities and school districts in particular in the South. And so that's a more national campaign that really speaks to the politics of bonds. So those are three examples. And you all give me 1 second. I'm going to fix this light.
Thanks very much, Destin, for your great answers.
Sure, Tom. Hold on. Okay, sorry, y'all.
Tom, and then Max.
A different Tom here. This is Tom Hanchett down in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this is just an amazing presentation. It plays off of so many things that are so important. I've done some work previously on looking at tax policy, accelerated depreciation, as one of the ways that suburban development in particular was subsidized in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and up to the present. But what I'm into now is a history of affordable housing on the ground in Charlotte, North Carolina, which involves me in all sorts of stuff. And one of the things, what I want to do is talk more with some of y'all about this. I'm going to make a real quick pitch, and then Raquel Forrester is going to try and connect me with people. But in the 80s, North Carolina creates a housing finance agency. Most states do the same thing about the same time. And what they do is they issue tax-exempt bonds, and they create a trust fund, a pool of money that can be used for what I would call gap financing in the new low-income housing tax credit program. And you probably know about low-income housing tax credits. It's still the way we fund a lot of affordable housing. And basically the subsidy goes to private investors. Private investors get a tax break and they magnanimously put their money into building housing for low-income folks. Well, the bond market is yet another way that our public housing finance stream gets directed uphill to folks who are already making money and make more money. And so Tom at historysouth.org, if you have reactions to that or you know much more about that or it sounds interesting, let me know.
Yeah, Tom, just really briefly, thank you for that observation, bringing that to this discussion. I think the only thing I'll say is I have a colleague, John Robinson III. He's a sociologist. He teaches at Princeton, and his project is all about low income tax credits. And so he's somebody who you definitely want to connect with. He's a really kind guy, brilliant guy, and someone who would be good to think with.
Yeah, feel free to jump back in, Max.
Well, I'm struck by something. I was wondering if you mentioned this in your book about municipal bonds for sporting arenas and performing arts centers, because I'm here in Newark, New Jersey, and they floated the bonds almost $200 and something million to build an arena. And they did it by circumventing the public referendum by going through the housing authority and having them issue those bonds. And I'm curious if you want to talk about like the modern day implications here with cities that are investing in sports and performing arts and other ways that, are not, and frankly, those institutions are not being built for the residents of the cities either. They appeal mostly to suburbanites who come in for entertainment.
Sure. I think I didn't know those specifics of that example. I think the two things I'll say is towards the end of the book, I begin with Dianne Feinstein, or I end the book, I should say, with Dianne Feinstein, who is either just come back from or on her way to meeting with Moody's analysts and credit rating analysts in New York. And at the time, what I do is just kind of think about, again, going back to this idea that cities are in the lion's den thoroughly because of government cuts, forced to borrow at high rates, and the kinds of projects they then need to prioritize in order to not only achieve economic growth, but in order to avoid downgrades out of fear that they won't hit revenue targets. And so thinking about the kinds of projects that then become palatable, that then become acceptable, convention centers are one, stadiums are one. And so really what I would just say is to kind of historicize this contemporary borrowing, using the tax-exempt bond market to build stadiums and convention centers in this present moment. Though we see a little bit of a move away from that. I'm out here in the Bay Area, and so we have the threat of the Oakland A's leaving Oakland in the sense of who's going to pay for what, how much public funding, public dollars will be used. So that's the current state of things. But I do want to highlight the kinds of options, the circumscription and the curtailing of options that cities had in the 1980s, and how stadiums become one way in which they can meet or avoid the wrath, I suppose, or the penalties in the form of downgrades in the 1980s. So to me, it just speaks to the emphasis on these kinds of projects that don't benefit the people who live there, who if a city is able to, in fact, build a convention center or a stadium, will necessarily involve forms of displacement, if not of people, then of social ties, and how in many ways, a lot of that is, again, related to interest rates declining, federal aid, and so forth. So that's kind of one thing I'll say. And yeah, I think maybe I'll just leave it there. But yeah, I don't say too much about that, but I do gesture toward that at the end of the book.
I'm happy to jump back in if there's if there's anyone else. I really like this, your use of the term conscription. I think it's really apt and kind of speaks to a lot of what I do too. And this idea of kind of intentionality of racial inequality manifests on a number of different levels is, I think something that you mentioned, the kind of growing acknowledgement of the consequences of redlining, which is where most of my work is. And, I think you're right in kind of making the case for your work that very few people kind of understand this particular dimension of kind of racial history. And I'm wondering how you think about conversations about about reparations and how it relates to your work. Again, from my lens, when I think about reparations, I'm thinking about the racial wealth gap on the, kind of manifest on the individual or the household level because of exclusion from housing policies and employment policies. But is there a way that you think about reparations on a neighborhood level or a municipal level that kind of comes from this history?
Yeah, great question, Jacob. This is challenging because I was asked this question at Berkeley a few weeks ago, and the answer I came to, kind of stumbled through, but ultimately came to is if the argument that I make is that the financial arrangements are crucial to the kinds of displacement we see in post-World War II cities, San Francisco in particular, but elsewhere. And those folks are on the move or have been displaced. What is the obligation of, say, the city of San Francisco that carried out Negro removal, as it was described, or urban renewal by way of borrowing from financial institutions, to folks who don't necessarily and probably don't live in San Francisco? I mean, we could think about, the film The Last Black Man in San Francisco as essentially suggesting that the kind of remarkable demographic change from less than 5,000 Black folks in 1940 to, some 90,000 Black folks by 1970, and then the decline in Black folks in the city. Where do they live? Where do their descendants live? Is it possible for a city, or should a city like San Francisco be on the hook in the form of reparations when many of the folks who were perhaps displaced or their descendants don't live there? So I think it's a difficult question around municipal-based reparations. So that's kind of how I approach the reparations piece. I do think, though, that if you think about financial institutions who underwrote many of these projects and which still exist, this is the question: what is the obligation of a Bank of America and the banking syndicates that underwrote different forms of displacement throughout American cities? They still exist. Is there an obligation there? And this relates to something I kind of hinted at the beginning of the talk, which is like, if we place the responsibility of the racial wealth gap through housing policy at the footsteps or at the front door of the federal government, is it possible that Black folks would effectively pay for their own reparations? If we think about the different ways in which the federal government generates money and finds ways to conscript, again, different forms of citizens, different types of citizens to generate the funds needed to pay reparations. I mean, the danger, I think, of placing the blame on the federal government and not at private entities is that form of paying for one's own reparation. Whereas you could think about financial institutions who, at the very least, were in partnership with federal, state, and local governments who should be responsible. And I mean, obviously, we could think about other ways in which these entities can pass on the cost to consumers, and that's something to be concerned with as well. But that's in general how I view the reparations piece. I think also what I just want to say briefly is around questions of debt, and you mentioned conscription. For me, the book and my essay in the racial capitalism volume is thinking about racial governance through debt. Governance is raising the question, who rules over whom and through what means? And it raises other philosophical, I guess, or political questions around what is choice? What does consent mean? Again, if the idea that, as Tom said, a very highly educated voter, but is only presented with a yes or no choice with information that has been greatly screened, what does it mean to vote for that issue? Have you offered your consent to such an issue, given that you're really only seeing a kind of flattened issue before you? And so the project, I think, has a lot to say about urban inequality, but I also think it has much more to say about questions of governance, consent, legitimacy, and the municipal debt and municipal bond finance in particular is, I think, a particularly productive site for those kinds of questions. And those are questions, lastly, that have largely, of course, been taken up by folks of, third world scholars, folks interested in the, debt crises in the global South, but I think are equally apt here in the US context.